Are you looking for a miracle? You expect the impossible. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic had an enormous impact on how religious communities, in particular, gathered for worship. And Ryan Burge, an assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University, had observed in his May 2021 article published in The Conversation that public health experts had strongly urged churches to cease congregational meetings during the worst parts of the pandemic, noting that religious services were an ideal vector to spread the virus. Similar stories had appeared in the Washington Post after the infection and death of Bishop Gerald Glenn before the first Eastern pandemic. And like Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring, in his litigations defending the government response to the COVID-19 pandemic, these experts had pointed to incidents such as that in March 2020, when a choir practice in Washington state in a church resulted in 87% of attendees being infected with COVID-19 and 2 members losing their lives. However, in terror, they say, kill one and scare 1,000. And in the Easter season, even Jesus found his disciples falling asleep when he told them to stay awake. And scientists acknowledge that large public health outbreaks are historically associated with times of fear, confusion, and helplessness. Provocative emotions, which probably for most tend to motivate them to become fixated upon feelings and not focused on facts. Forgetting words even in Scripture, that you are sheep sent amongst wolves. Forgetting even the words of Paul in his epistles, that there will come times when people will turn their ears away from truth. And exhortations to watch thou in all things, doing the work of an evangelist, making full proof of thy ministry, and keeping the faith. But as Professor Burge had pointed out, the closures were met by a massive backlash among conservative Christians who had believed that executive orders closing religious institutions were a clear violation of First Amendment's freedom of religion protection. Not necessarily connected with looking at the reality of a pandemic in which people were being infected and even dying, while some places of worship simply ignored state closures. And many questioned whether or not that was necessarily a wise thing to do. And as late as May 2021, just like former Virginia Governor Ralph Northam in early December 2020, who had claimed as the nation's only physician serving as a state governor that he had heard reports, Professor Burge, expressing great concerns about churches reopening at that time, had been convinced that the trend in the data is unmistakable. The more frequently someone goes to church, the more likely they were to report that they had been diagnosed with COVID-19 during the first 7 months of the pandemic. Usually during this time of year, when the Lenten season is observed by those in the Christian religious faith tradition, this coincides with the celebration of the Passover, and the Seder meal is shared in religious devotion in the Judaic religious faith tradition, marking that time recorded in the book of Exodus when the angel of death, some say Michael, had descended upon Egypt, where the Israelites had been held in bondage for 400 years. The final plague in a series of 10, which, according to this biblical account, which you can even watch in the Cecil B. DeMille film, had been inflicted upon Egypt to persuade Pharaoh to release the Israelites from slavery. Essentially a tale of biological terror and extortion, which had been quite successful at bringing about a very political objective, freeing the Israelites. And at least the Encyclopedia Britannica reports that biological warfare of this type dates as far back as the Assyrians in the 4th century BC, a means of what military planners call low-intensity conflict that exploits the ignorance of adversaries to achieve surprise for an extended period. While we experienced a pandemic that lasted for 3 years, while historically, pandemics without pharmacological intervention tend to last between 18 and 24 months, as pointed out by former acting CIA Director Mike Morrell in May 2020 on CBS News. And this enables a first strike capability with the advantages of plausible deniability. Pretty much like Odysseus in the Iliad, telling the blinded Polyphemus when he asked who was attacking him, he would answer, Nemo, nobody. And as former SecDef General Lloyd Austin had said while serving as CENTCOM commander earlier in his military career, you can't win a war without the right information. It's just common sense. And accordingly, in the military decision-making process, even before making assumptions or developing theories, military leaders, especially those engaged in the work of intelligence, began the process by compiling a comprehensive list of the indisputable facts, just the facts. Because failure to develop a refined picture of the threat as early as possible tends to have a cumulative snowball effect, distorting the process of obtaining an accurate picture to target with a reasonably calculated solution. Just as failures in the Panama Canal construction had resulted in the loss of over 22,000 lives. Persons who had thought malaria had been caused by bad air. And what happens when someone screams fire in a crowded theater? What happens when there is a loss of trust? There's a wonderful scene in Failsafe where the Russians are chasing the decoys, even though they're being told by the Americans not to chase the decoys. But because of that level of distrust, the bombers get through to Moscow, and you have the finale of the bomber arriving in Moscow and the pilot saying, I am the Matador. Some say that hindsight is 20/20. However, the job of intelligence is not that of a historian producing a documentary on what should have occurred. Military commanders expect their intelligence professionals to meet the moment in a timely manner, so as to enable those with boots on ground and eyes on the objective to alter what may, at the time, in the heat of battle, appear to be an inevitable outcome. It's called force protection. And apparently some had been able, even in the face of surges in cases, mounting hospitalizations, and even rising death tolls, to pause for a security halt to apply cool heads in a hot situation. And surprisingly, as early as February 4th, 2020, just days after the WHO had declared a public health emergency of international concern, PHEIC, pursuant to Section 564 of the FD&C Act, Congress had already a law on the books. HHS Secretary Alex Azar had determined that there is a public health emergency that has a significant potential to affect national security, generally defined as foreign affairs and military forces, or the health and security of the United States citizens living abroad. And that involves a novel, new coronavirus, nCoV, first detected in Wuhan City, Hubei Province, China in 2019, 2019 nCoV. The virus, now named SARS-CoV-2, which causes the illness COVID-19. On March 27, 2020, less than 2 weeks after the WHO pandemic declaration, 1 month after the first infection of a member of the military, and just a few days before the first military fatality had been infected aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, HHS Secretary Azar had made the determination before issuing the emergency use authorization on the basis of his determination of a public health emergency that has a significant potential to affect national security or the health and security of United States citizens living abroad, and that it involved the novel new coronavirus. He had declared that circumstances then existed justifying the authorization of emergency use of drugs and biological products during the COVID-19 pandemic, again pursuant to Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, subject to the terms of any authorization issued under that section. Under that authorizing statute, Secretary Azar could only authorize the development of what are now called the COVID-19 vaccines if he had determined that there was a public health emergency or a significant potential for a public health emergency that affects or has a significant potential to affect national security, strictly defined, or the health and security of the United States citizens living abroad, which does not include everybody. And that involves a CBRN agent or agents, or a disease or condition that may be attributable to such agent or agents. A CBRN agent is by definition a biological weapon, not a highly contagious disease to prevent or mitigate. And that was what was written in the law in February to March 2020. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. And to date, on a per capita basis, we've done worse than virtually all other countries. While some say there's no reason that a rich country like ours has to have over 1.2 million deaths, indicative that something clearly went wrong. Mostly the elderly, amongst those who are dead, who had early been identified as the most vulnerable, even if officially some still don't know exactly what it was that went wrong. And during this time, most churches did in fact close, while others were more concerned about having their First Amendment rights abridged and permitting them to continue to worship. A time did come when they did not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts had kept unto themselves teachers having itching ears. And they did turn away their ears from the truth, which was written in the law, and had been turned unto fables. Did thou watch in all things? Did thou endure afflictions, doing the work of an evangelist, making full proof of thy ministry? Did thou preach the word, being instant in season, out of season, reproving, rebuking, exhorting with all long-suffering and doctrine? Did you just take the time to read the law? Were you looking for a miracle? Were you expecting the impossible? Isn't that special? And you look like an intelligent person. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.